Who was Homer? So in this episode, we are going to look at questions like, who was he? Why do we read the Iliad? Why should we read it? Did Homer even write the Iliad, right? What translations of the Iliad should we use? And is there any guide? Is there a guide that we can actually look at to explore these questions? So please join us as we look at why should we read Homer?
Yeah, so this is a good idea. Like we should talk about who Homer is before we talk about the Iliad, before we start to talk about the Odyssey. That we're gonna be taking a full year to break down this work. We should probably talk about the author first, right? That would make sense.
Correct.
So who is Homer? Who is this dude?
Right. So if we're looking at the Iliad, the first thing I would say is, the Iliad is about the city of Troy. So we can kind of start there and use that as our kind of guidepost as we work through this. So Troy was said to have fallen in 1184 BC. So 1184 BC, right?
Okay.
So before our Lord Jesus Christ. So Troy is a city-state, which basically means it's an autonomous nation in one city. So a city-state, or sometimes you'll hear a polis, right? The city-state. It's on the western coast of Asia Minor, and what is actually today Turkey. And so you have this very wealthy, magnificent, kind of world-renowned city-state named Troy. And Troy falls, right? And so this is what the Iliad, kind of as a general introduction, is about, right? It's about the fall of Troy. So when we're looking at the fall of Troy is 1184, Homer is not until about 850.
Okay, so can you give me some kind of reference point of what's going on, maybe in the Bible, or what's happening, so that way I can kind of...
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have, if you look at 1184 BC, what's going on with say that's the Greeks, what's going on with the Hebrews, a good guidepost would be King David. So King David,
Okay.
the zenith, the height of his reign in Jerusalem is 1000 BC, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just prior to Israel venturing off into a monarchy. So they have their first King Saul, then David. And so if you look at the Hebrew history, that's where we are. So Troy falls right in that same time period, right?
Okay.
That's kind of the ancient history that we're looking at. Homer then comes around probably around 850 BC is where he is. So the one thing to look at is the classical Greeks, right? So when we think of classical Greeks, we think of Greeks in the 300s, right? So we're going to think of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. When we think usually when we say ancient Greece, that's what we think of.
Sure,
right?
that's what my mind goes to, yeah.
Right, we think of these beautiful colonnades and these buildings and et cetera. So one thing to think about is that the fall of Troy, the Iliad, was actually already, quote unquote, ancient history for the classical Greeks. So they looked back on it as part of their ancient history. So you have the fall of Troy, say around...
It's the ancients.
The ancients, right? Exactly. So it's around, say 1184 BC, you have Homer in 850, and you have the classical Greeks around 300, 400. So they're looking back through the story, right, as kind of a collection of their own ancestors. And so when you look at who Homer is, it's hard for us to actually know a whole lot about him. He is Greek, right? Mm-hmm. He is probably what they would call a bard, which means someone who recites oral poetry, particularly the great deeds and histories of a people. So imagine a aristocratic class of people gathered around feasting, enjoying life, and then this bard is going to come up and tell originally what would have been a memorized, or at least a story that's malleable, that he can kind of form on the fly,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he's going to tell the story to these people. And that's originally what the story of the Iliad was. It's originally a oral rendition. It's a poem, right? It's recited out loud about the histories and the great deeds of the Greek peoples.
Yeah, this is even hard to fathom a little bit, that their mind was so well formed and organized to be able to memorize such things, right? There's no way in today's world that I could I could memorize this at least. And maybe I'm speaking out of turn for everybody else of our listeners, but like there's no way I could sit here and memorize this whole thing. But this was something that was normal. This is something that was very regular that was happening in this day and age. There was nothing written. Everything was oral.
Correct. And actually, this is, if I recall correctly, so like Homer's coming in really on the front edge, the cuff of things being reduced to writing, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you think of Homer, one of the things that's interesting is that we can have a few preliminary observations. One, he did not invent the story, right? The story is presented as history. Two, even the story of Troy, the Iliad, existing as a poem predates Homer. So one way you can look at it is like this story was known to these peoples, and this story was passed down through these bards, and Homer's mastery is then not necessarily in like inventing the story or sitting down and writing it out of nothing, but rather his mastery is actually pulling all of these things together, right? And kind of weaving together this tale. Because then when you read it, at least in my opinion, I think, and you see the kind of the genius that is Homer, he can take all these things together, but then what comes out of it is this very coherent story that has a lot of layers, right? You can say there's a lot of intentionality here. So he either, writes it himself, or there are traditions that he's blind and things like this. I think that kind of plays into him. Do you
think he was?
I don't know. I have no idea. It's poetic. I like it. Right. I like it to a certain degree because it's poetic. He's this bard. He's blind, and so what he's actually doing is, he's just mastered this tradition. He's mastered all these stories, and he recites it to like a scribe, right? Who's going to write these things out.
Do you know how many like manuscripts that we have of the Iliad?
Like, I do not.
Yeah.
When they put them down into writing, at least because they start to have them on like papyrus scrolls and things like this. When they start to put them down, one of the theories is that that's where the 24 books of the Iliad come from.
Okay.
Right. So the 24 book, because it wouldn't have been in a book, right? There would not have been.
Man, that would have been so
does
frustrating.
That make sense?
Yeah, that would have been so frustrating too if you would have seen like you get all of them and then like you miss book 19. Like you're like missing book 19. You're like, what happened?
Right. So you've got. So originally those would have been the different scrolls in theory, right? That's one theory that there were 24. It took 24 scrolls.
Okay.
To actually reduce this. To writing. So then the Iliad, if Homer's at like 850, the Iliad might be coming to us down like 725, 675 BC.
Okay.
Right. So about 600 years before Christ, we're getting this. It's interesting too, if you look at the text, and if anyone's actually kind of like ventured ahead and started to read it, there's these little things, when he introduces characters, there's going to be all these little things like, if he says Hera, he's going to call her like white-armed. Or if he talks about like Menelaus, the king of Sparta, right? He's like Lord of the war cry. Hector.
Some of them he gets very creative.
Yeah, they're very creative. Yeah. Hector's, breaker of horses. Achilles.
That's kind of a lamer one.
Well, horses are somewhat important at this time period.
Yeah,
right?
but I mean, you get like, great warriors and great, you get all these like really cool adjectives to describe somebody. And then you got, they got the guy who's the tamer of horses. It's like, that's a good thing to be. It's also a good thing to be a cobbler, like at that time.
Yeah.
But
so, and sometimes too, I mean, you have to, this is kind of the genius of it. You have to watch these because it's kind of easy for the mind to become somewhat numb to them because you're like, okay, this is clearly some kind of space filler. Right.
Is that what it is?
Well, okay, so two thoughts before I forget. So one, what I was going to mention is I think they really have to be paid attention to because he does use them to give insights into the character, and sometimes he contrasts them, right? So as you say, the lame, breaker of horses for Hector, we might explore later whether there's some meaning behind that. But then later on, Achilles, right? So Hector's with the Trojans, Achilles is with the Greeks, is known as the breaker of men. Right, so if you watch, he's making these like comparisons. We have to ask ourselves why, but they're called epithets. These little epithets, these little like epithets. It's kind of a fun word to say, epithet, right? And these little phrases, and what they originally are, is they're these little phrases that allow the bard who's reciting this orally to fit people's names into lines of poetry while still keeping the meter. It also gives him like space fillers as he's like thinking of things and what the next line is. So if like everyone's name always just comes with like this pre-baked little introduction, basically, like white-armed Hera or Odysseus is a mastermind like Zeus. It gives you, like, you already get like 6 or so words there that the bard already knows are coming, and then he can like play around with it. So
Okay.
Homer,
So you think it's also like, so it's a memorization tactic, and then also like to help with cadence?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so I think one thing is like Homer receives these from the oral traditions, but I don't think they're reducible to simply, they're just space fillers.
Okay.
I think he uses them to teach us something about the character, and he plays around with them to contrast and compare different characters throughout the story.
Yeah, and I mean, as we go throughout this podcast, you'll realize very very quickly that ancients are always intentional with their writings, right? It doesn't matter what it doesn't matter who it is. In the ancients, like, and maybe that's just because paper was a hot commodity at the time, and like you had to make sure you utilize it the best you can. But every word is very intentional, and yet if you don't take note of it, you're gonna miss
Correct.
something.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, you read Homer the same way that you read Scripture, in the fact that Scripture doesn't really give any unnecessary details, right? So, like most of the time when like Scripture introduces a character, they don't really tell you what the character looks like, right? They don't tell you like this is the color of their hair, this is how tall they are, they're big. But if Scripture does happen to start telling you that, there's usually a reason, right? That character is being contrasted with something, or it has something to do with their virtue, or these types of things. Homer is very much the same way, right? If we find him kind of giving us some details, it should alert us to the fact of like, why is this important?
Yeah.
Not that everything I think is reducible to some kind of like esoteric meaning. You read the Iliad, people get hit with rocks in the face and both their eyes pop out.
Yeah.
Right. And we're not going to sit there and think about like, oh, what is this?
Does that mean? Yeah.
Right. What is the spear to the intellect, to the eye? Right. Like it's maybe not going to happen. But I do think, though, once you get used to his writing, you'll notice for some reason when he slows down the pace and starts giving detail, the flags should go up. Something's going on here that we should pay attention to.
Yeah. So we're going to spend a whole year on Homer, which is a long time, obviously. And this is going to be something that, like, if you're going to read it with us, which I highly recommend, especially, listen to our episode that we did, like, the importance of small groups, like the importance of getting together and reading good texts. Why? Like, why are we going to spend and dedicate so much time to reading Homer?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of other things we could read.
Correct.
Right?
Right.
Why are we going to spend so much time on him?
Yeah, why do most all great book lists start with Homer? Right? No, it's an excellent question. And even to push further, why not start with like Confucius? Why not start with like the Enuma Elish, right? Why not burn everything down and start with something that was written 10 years ago, right? I mean, why do we read these great books? So Homer really is the first great book, assuming we kind of put a caveat on sacred scripture, right? Because I think sacred scripture should be read alongside the great books, and it's incorporated in most great books programs. But we'll say that Homer really is like the first great book. In a certain way, I think just on a natural, not a flat level, but just like on a natural observation level, like we are broadly in the inheritance of Greek culture, right? I mean, Greek culture plays this very particular role in the West, right? We look to them, and so you say, okay, well, we trace, I think, just like a historical lineage back to them. And if you're going to start understanding the Greeks, which most people are going to jump to say, well, should we understand like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, right? These types of things, which are good. Really, the first, major cornerstone of that is going to be Homer, because you have to realize that there's like 300 years, 500 years between the two. And so, I mean, think about that for us. Like if we're studying something that's like 500 years old, right? So we have to kind of keep in mind again that when we talk about the classical Greeks, like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they're looking at Homer and the Iliad as basically their ancient history, right? These are their, forefathers.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, there's almost, 700 years, 800 years between when Troy fell and, when some of these guys are walking the earth. So they're in dialogue with Homer. Mm-hmm. So if you think like, well, I would rather read like, Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, these kind of guys. Well, if you read like Plato's Republic, he's heavily in dialogue with Homer.
Right.
Homer, and it's hard for us to think about today, but like this was their type of education insofar as poetry educates, right? It might not be like, maybe formally, but also just like it shapes the culture. So like if you have Athens, right, the polis, the city-state of Athens, like their youth are reading Homer. And Plato is noticing, right, and Socrates is noticing that then that has a formative aspect on the youth, right? They've received this poem. And so he's in dialogue with this and his works. And so we really just start with Homer because like, okay, well, we want to understand what he's in dialogue with, right? You kind of just keep pushing back until you hit a beginning. Because like, who's Homer in dialogue with? Well, nobody. Right,
Everything is oral at this point.
Right, so he's in dialogue with ancient myths and people groups that are already lost into this kind of like very mystic, time period, which the Iliad kind of mentions. Right, it mentions things like the men before us were so much greater and stronger than us. Right, when gods walked the earth and these kind of things. So we start really with Homer, you could say, like in a historical aspect, right, where it's like, okay, well, we're kind of downstream from the Greeks in Western culture. We've always looked to them, et cetera. And I think that's fine. I think that's somewhat of a flat reading of it, because I think then you would have difficulty with like, okay, well, what if I grew up in a different culture, right? Does that mean like then I do start with Confucius or I do start with the Enuma Elish? And those texts certainly have a lot of truth in them, right? They have observations, they have things that they can convey. Does Homer, is it just accidental, right, that I happen to be like born in a country that considers itself the West, therefore I look to Homer, right? And I think the answer to that is no. I think there's something very special going on here. And I think that one way to look at it is that you have this kind of thread of Greek thought moving through history. So you have Homer, and as we've mentioned, and you have like all these Greek playwrights that you can read, and then you get into Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Well, then Aristotle tutors Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great is going to have this kingdom, right? That he's going to take over the known worlds, and which is going to include Israel. And so what happens then in this time period is you get a convergence of this Hellenized Greek culture with then the Hebrew culture of the Old Testament. And so Pope Benedict talks about this in his kind of magisterial Regensburg address that he gave in 2006, about you really have to watch these two threads, these two particular cultures, the Greeks and the Hebrews, and they come together. And sometimes they come together in incredibly violent ways. Okay. Right. So if you look at Maccabees, like if you've read First or Second Maccabees, that's a war between the Jews and the Greeks, and there is no mutual enrichment there. There's no like, hey, we're dialoguing, like this is great. This is some.
Yeah, the 7 sons died.
Yeah, there's obviously these kind of proto martyrs. There's just brutalities. Right. Yeah. And so there it's like, well, this doesn't look like there's any harmony here. This is just a violence. But at the same time, you then also have other things happening. You have Old Testament books written right around this time period of, say, the Book of Wisdom, right? You have Sirach. And these books are like written in Greek. These books are dialoguing with the Greeks. Like, Book of Wisdom, just as an example, it's starting to make distinctions between different types of pagans, which we don't really see in the Old Testament, right? It's like, okay, we're Israel and the rest of everyone's a pagan. Like they're making distinctions between like the pagans that worship the false gods, right? These ones of like wood and stone, very Old Testament-esque that we'd be familiar with. But then they're also noticing, but there's also these other pagans that seem to be seeking like the one true God. They just seem to be seeking a monotheistic God that they can observe from nature alone. And Israel's now bumping into this culture.
A lot of those guys died.
Right. Like Israel's now bumping into this culture that seems to be seeking the same things it is, but through reason.
Right.
So like, for instance, like in the I'm pretty sure it's the Book of Wisdom, could be wrong though, it also lists the 4 natural virtues, right? So you have prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Those are the exact same 4 that you find in Aristotle and with some modification in Plato. So what you're seeing is all of a sudden these two cultures come together that I think like in the best sense of the way, in a charitable reading, is that they're both seeking the same thing. The Greeks are seeking God via their reason to understand the world, that the world is known. Okay. And Hebrews are coming to seek the world through faith. Okay. And what happens is that these two cultures come in dialogue with one another. And what Pope Benedict says is that there becomes this mutual enrichment, that this Greek reason and Hebrew faith are coupled with one another. And it starts to create this culture, particularly under Roman order, right? So then the Romans come in and conquer everybody. And so you have like these three groups, the Greek reason, the Hebrew faith, and Roman order. And this tills the soil, if you will, of the world for the reception of Jesus Christ. So St. Paul tells us that Jesus came in the fullness of time, right? Providence, like Jesus, it wasn't accidental when Christ came. He came when the world was ready to receive him. And so if we really take this seriously, and I think we should, because look at things like the Septuagint, right? The first canon of Old Testament scripture, which is like, say, 250 BC, is written in Greek. The New Testament, written in Greek, right, predominantly. And so I think sometimes we forget how much these cultures actually enriched one another, right? St. Paul's having references back to Septuagint when he's talking about their scriptures, right? About, these types of things. And so what Pope Benedict points out is that this gave in the New Testament a very distinct characteristic to the coming of Jesus Christ and the foundation of his church, the Catholic Church, right? That all of a sudden it taught us that faith and reason are in harmony with one another. It told us that faith and reason, as Pope John Paul II would say, right, they are the two wings on which we're going to ascend to God.
Okay.
And so just like you would start with Genesis to understand the Hebrews, you start with Homer to understand the Greeks. Like that's where we pick up this thread, right? Okay. So I think that in that, the incarnation, the coming of Jesus Christ into history, which we have to take, right, as a providential act, not something that's accidental, and also not something that we can do again today, right? We can't reinculturate the gospel again, right? It had this very definitive act in history. That becomes our guidepost. That becomes like, okay, this is what is important to understand Jesus Christ. And if we do that, then you have Hebrew faith, Greek reason coming together, and if you want to understand the Greeks, you start with Homer.
Okay, well, that makes sense. So if you are going to have the perseverance to do this with us, the fortitude to do this with us for 52 weeks, 48 weeks, I guess?
Yeah, 48 weeks. 24 books in both.
The Iliad and the Odyssey.
Correct.
One thing to do to make sure one mistake to avoid, I guess, is the wrong translation. Right? Because you can die on a vine trying to read this, and it could just end up being just brutal trying to figure out what is going on based on the translation alone. So there's a couple of things that we should probably talk about, like what translation are we going to be using and why we picked it. And then also, if we're reading it in a group, one thing that we need to make sure that we have is reference points to be able to talk about, right? So we need to make sure that we do have the numbers on the sides of the margins in order to be able to reference as we go through
Correct.
The book. So what translation are we using?
Okay, so yeah, a few excellent points, a few things that we should parse out. The one that I think we are going to have the most recourse to is this one. You have it as well, right? The Iliad, translated by Robert Fagles. So there you go. It's a wonderful book. It also has an excellent introduction and notes by Bernard Knox. So it comes together. This is a Penguin classic, I believe. It's published really well. It's a wonderful book. It has plenty of room to take notes and to mark up. As you can tell, mine is very marked up.
Yeah, mine's all sorts of marked up. Now, I guess we should probably give this fair warning, right? This is the first time that I've read this. I'm reading through this with you guys, right? This is my very first time that I'm reading it. You've read it a couple times.
This will be my third time to read it. So yeah, we had a great books program when I was at Ave Maria University, but it began with philosophy. So we started with Plato and Socrates, right? We didn't start with the Poetics.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, as we go through this, I will be learning with you guys, trying to read these stories. And one of the reasons, I mean, we've talked about this on another episode, but one of the reasons why I want to do this is because I want to learn this so I can pass it on to my children, because I think it's very important.
Yeah, right? We have our small group that we're reading the Iliad with, right? A bunch of men come over to my house Sunday night. We read this together. When we kicked it off, we had 12 guys, right, in total. Probably half, I think, had never even read it before.
Right.
And it is interesting that I then think also half the group are fathers who understand in some level, I've been deprived a certain level of education, right? Like very intelligent, right? Some are doctors, some are lawyers, some et cetera.
Right.
And I would throw
some are even communications directors.
Some are even diocesan communications directors, or haphazardly somehow became chancellors.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I include myself in this too, right? So I'm a convert, right? Came over, across the Tiber over from Protestantism. So like I didn't convert until after my undergraduate. And, despite going through high school and undergrad, like we had no recourse to the classics, right? It was just, it was lucky if we read a book that, was older than 20 years.
Right.
Even my undergraduate was called Theological Historical Studies, simply because we read anything prior to 1900. Right. So, just completely, this kind of newer is better. Everything's great right now. We all have iPhones, like Google things or use AI. Like, why do we need to go back and look at something that was written 2,500 years ago? So, I think that a lot of these men then in the group are, I think it was humbling, and I think it's kind of a beautiful thing as they're part of their fatherhood, is that they want to read this before their children become of age. Because the Iliad is the first book your kids are going to read, really in like, say, freshman year of high school. They're going to read the Iliad to start off the great books, right? And it keeps your attention because it's not a giant bunch of philosophical debates and things like this. The gods are coming down. The gods are jealous. Like, things are going on. People get speared in the face. Like, there's things that keep your attention, right? It starts off with rage, and we don't even know what's going on yet. We don't even know who Achilles is or who's Agamemnon. Like, we don't know any of these people, and they're already fighting, and the gods are fighting, and everyone's fighting. And so it keeps their attention while also introducing them to what we call the perennial truths, right? These perennial questions that we need to ask ourselves that are just as relevant for us as it was for them. So, I think that's a beautiful thing to read it, to then pass it on, to your family. One of the things, that's one of the reasons I got started in the great books was actually say, I want to form myself in a certain way,
right,
and I want to be able to pass that on. And now my children are going to a classical school.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, now I'm kind of feel like I'm playing catch up to even keep up with where they are, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So, okay, so circling back.
Yeah, so we're doing Fagles, but there's also...
So there's Latimer.
Right.
Richmond, Latimer. Another great text. So we have recourse to him as well. We'll talk about it, but our guide that we have on all these questions on the Iliad to kind of lead people through it.
This one's Samuel Butler, I believe.
Correct, which I think is like a late 1800s translation. So
and there's also Alexander Pope.
So Alexander Pope has like the first... real like beautiful English translation of the Iliad.
It's hard to read
for
me.
It is very difficult to read.
I read the first page and I was like, yeah, this isn't for me.
Yeah, and
it's pretty. It's beautiful to listen, like to read. But I finished it and was like, I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, I think Wordsworth has a translation of the Divine Comedy, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I've even read the comedy several times, and I still can't figure out what he's talking about, like, as it goes through there. So, And most of your like this one is like this beautiful hardback, etc. That's affordable. Most of those are utilizing some translation that's in the common domain, and so it's going to be an older translation, which might be difficult to keep up with. So I would highly recommend Fagles is the translation that we're going to be quoting from, probably using the most. We pull from that one for like notes, the guide, things like this. Latimer, I'm pretty sure, is the text they read at Thomas Aquinas College in California, kind of this great books school, if you will. Great books in the best sense of that term. And so they're reading Latimer, also has a really good introduction as well. So those are the two that I'd probably recommend you pick up, one of them. The other thing, as you mentioned, and I just want to reiterate it, particularly if you're trying to read this in a small group, or you're going to, follow us in the podcast and say, hey, where are you guys talking about? Is whatever translation you do pick up, there's these little numbers off on the side of the page, and they're the line numbers. So there's 24 books, and the book's broken down into line numbers. And if you're following along with us, whatever translation you have really has to have those numbers, or you have whole books, and we're going to be talking about stuff you can't follow, right? So we had one person in our group show up with a translation.
They didn't have those numbers.
And they basically just shut their book and listened the whole time because they couldn't keep up with it.
Right.
So it's just a small distinction, but something I think you should watch. And a lot of the classic texts, particularly ancient texts, have that. And I'd always err on finding a text that has those numbers because they help tremendously.
Okay. So not only do we have the Fagles translation, we're going to be marking up in our books, making notes, things like that. But what else are we going to have to accompany us through this story?
Right. So we have a guide, right? We actually have a written out guide that you can go to the website, you can find, you can download.
thegreatbookspodcast.com.
Thegreatbookspodcast.com. Very good. And so it's question answers. We've put together this guide, in a question answer format. It's going to handle a lot of things we talked about today, just like the preliminaries, who's Homer, what's the Iliad, like how do I know these things. Has a lot of citations, so if you want to drill down into like, what are some sources I can look at.
Yeah, take some deep dives.
Yeah, I mean, if you're, a little freshman at college and you just got to sign the Iliad, like, here you go, happy birthday, like, here's all your citations, here you go,
Right,
like, this is how it works.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you are welcome. And so, and then we'll have a certain amount of questions, depending on like the book and how complicated it is, per book, right? And so, each book will kind of open up with what just happened, like what's just like a summary of the narrative, right? So what's going on in this book? What should we know? Who are the main characters? And then it'll just be question and answer, just kind of like picking out some of the themes, the perennial truths, things that we should be drawing from the text, right? Hey, did you pay attention to why this guy said this, or did you notice that he said this, but now he's doing that? Like helping you to track through the text, because it is a poem. And so because of that, sometimes how it expresses things, we would say, right, poetically, right? It's not a prose. It's not directly, always telling you exactly what Homer's trying to actually convey. So you have to have an attentive reading as you kind of read through these things. And I think that, a lot of us, even if you've read it before, the Iliad's a text. Like for me, this is my third read through, reading it with you guys, which I'm delighted to do. And I think that honestly, this is the one that I have enjoyed the most.
Yeah.
This is the one that I think it's like come alive. One, because we have the guide, we have a small group, we're coming together in a fraternity to read these things, but also just because I've read it multiple times. Like the first time you're kind of just trying to track the narrative, like it starts off in the middle, like what is going on?
Right.
And so there's like
this person, who's that? If you're not even familiar with the mythology, that's another
mythology
thing
is another big deal.
Like, because I'm not, this is another thing that I'm, learning as we go. And so as I was reading, I was like, okay, hold on, who is this person? Who's that person? And so as I've been going through, this is another point that we make a lot in this podcast, is the importance of tracking the narrative and writing it down, taking notes in your book, so that way you can be like just a little memory jogger, like, oh yeah, this is what's happening as you're tracking through the story. It's really important to do.
Correct. So two things on that. One is, if we're recommending books, I would recommend Edith Hamilton's Mythology, The Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes. This is 1942 classic. This is like the classic encyclopedia, even though that makes it sound more flat than it actually is. It has a lot of life into it.
Nerd.
But and it actually includes, it says, it's funny because it's like gods and heroes, and I think it's like 98% the Greek culture, and it has like a few pages on Norse.
Okay.
But this is what I keep if I'm reading the Iliad, and I'm like, wait, who is this god? Or sometimes, because Homer's audience, which is something actually we need to talk about, right?
Okay.
Homer's audience knows these gods and knows these stories. These are ancient stories to them.
Right.
So like he doesn't always like parse all of this out. And so this has been a wonderful. This has really been a wonderful kind of like supplement as I'm reading through it, and I come up, it's like, wait, who's Hephaestus? Like, why does Zeus have this? Like, what is Athena the goddess of exactly? Like, she seems to be playing multiple roles. And also, even if you're really familiar with classical mythology, some of it's different in Homer's time.
Sure.
The stories change, right? So like Hephaestus, right, the smith god, the fire god, he makes these artifacts and weapons. In the Iliad, he's married to one of the three Graces. In the Odyssey, just even the next book by Homer, he's married to Aphrodite. So the mythology is also kind of developing, and so this Edith's book is a just phenomenal reference guide. The other thing I would mention that you brought up is writing in your book. Write in your book. Like, get a pen and write in your book.
Yeah, when you first told me that, I was a little scandalized, to be honest with you, because it's like,
right.
I still haven't been able to do it in the Summa. Like, I still have not gotten. I know that it's a good thing to do. I've seen the benefits of it. I'm very pro writing in your book. I still can't do it with the Summa yet. Maybe I'll continue to grow and make my way there.
Yeah, I think here's the thing: you read a great book to reread it.
Right.
Okay, so your first time reading it, what you're doing is you're like, I'm going to help future Adam, right? Future Adam will read this text again. He's going to read it by himself. He's going to read it in a small group. He's going to read it to his children. Like at some point, he's going to read this.
Right.
And what you're doing is you're really creating a map as you go through the text. And I think where people get stumbled is they're like reading and they're like, what they think they have to write down is like, I had some brilliant insight into Homer,
Right.
and I have to capture my brilliant insight on the page. And because I don't have brilliant insights, or this might be stupid, I'm not writing anything down.
Right.
And I really think that's a misread. I think what you do is that, so some really basic things I do is I tend to put like little circles around, little squares around who's even talking. Right now, just like, so if the character
Just the
shifts,
track.
yeah, just the track.
Right.
Because then, like, particularly if you're in a small group, right, and someone says, okay, well, I really liked what this person said, and you open your book and it's just blank, like there's nothing there. Like, you've got to give yourself little signposts. You've got to give yourself like tracking things. So like, I'm going to mark like who's speaking, right? Just as I go through it, not because I'm doing anything that's like anal retentive or because like I have to mark in it, but simply because it helps me track like what's going on. And I can use my intellect like not to keep track of who's speaking and not to keep track of like this back and forth, but rather like I just mark that and I know it and I move on, and I can really maybe try and pay attention to some of the deeper layers that are going on. And also it's very helpful. A lot of people are like, well, I can keep track as I read through. Congratulations. I'm glad. Like, so can I. But when you want to go back and look at a chapter, like, wait, why did Zeus just do this? Didn't he just tell so-and-so a little bit ago that like...
The exact opposite?
Right. Well, then you start flipping through your book. Like you you look at your page and you immediately know what the dialogue is, as opposed that if it's just blank. So I would, and I'd do that. I'd underline things. I'd put little asterisks out to the side, particularly when there's major plot points, or like you'll notice like in the Iliad, people make oaths. They make promises to the gods. The gods make promises to them. Anytime that happens, you mark it, because what you're getting is structure to the text, right? Like they're going to make this one little oath, they're going to make this promise, and that promise is going to echo throughout the entire book.
Right.
So
or when momentums shift.
Right.
I mean, that's another one that I try to make sure to understand. Like,
like between the armies
between
and
the
things.
armies,
Yeah.
the momentum is now with the Trojans. That way I'm tracking who's winning and what, and that helps as you go understand what the gods are doing, what the army is doing, and it just is very helpful.
Yeah. So if you're not used to it, I would just do it. Like, no one's gonna take your book and judge your notes. Like, don't worry about it. Like, write out Adamite. Like, write out questions. Right. Like, what does this mean? Why did he do this? Right. And I think that's great. And then as you go through, what's the worst thing that's gonna happen? You pick up the Iliad here in like 5 years and you read it again. You're like, man, these were dumb insights. You know what that means? That means you grew.
Right.
That means you matured. You had a maturation of your intellect. Right. I pick up certain books. I read, my introduction to the intellectual life was mainly C.S. Lewis, because for whatever reason, that was the only intellectual we were allowed to read as, evangelical, charismatic amalgamations of whatever I was, right? So, I read that. Like, I had to pick off one of his books the other day off my shelf, The Four Loves. I wanted to look at something. And I look at some of my notes, and I kind of died inside a little bit, right? Like, I was just like, oh my gosh. But honestly, then what I said was, it's a moment of piety. It's a moment of gratitude.
Sure.
Like, Lord, where have you taken me?
Yeah.
Right? Like, Lord, where have you matured me in this? Right? And I think the same thing with Iliad. Like, write your notes out. Don't be afraid. Yeah. Mark it down. Watch your intellect grow.
Okay. One more tip that I have.
Oh, boy.
For the Iliad.
Okay. Go for it.
This is a guy, who has not read it. Skip the introduction. Skip it.
Oh, yeah, we should say that.
Especially if you're starting in a small group. If you want to lose members very quickly in your small group, have everybody read the introduction first.
Right.
It's very long. To me, I don't think it really helps.
It's not an actual introduction.
Right.
So the other thing, too, by the way, that if you haven't read the Iliad, most introductions to classical texts assume you've read it before, and they will ruin huge plot points for you.
Right. So just start book one.
Just start at book one. And actually what you should do is just follow our guide, which goes question answer. And by the way, like, we've read the introduction to Fagles by Knox. We've read Latimer's. Right. Like, we've cited the things that I think need to be stripped out of those. And our guide's going to go question answer, just a few preliminaries like we're talking about now, and then go straight into book one. And I think it can really help.
Well, I'm pumped. I'm ready. I'm ready to take a deep dive into book one.
Right. So one last thing. So maybe two last things.
Okay.
The audience. So we talked about Homer. We talked about the book.
Yeah. Okay.
Who's he writing to, or what's he doing? And we kind of alluded to this quickly, but he's really talking to an aristocratic class of Greeks, right? And I think this will become incredibly important as we move through the Iliad, because what we need to realize is that he's writing to these people, and these stories are being told to this kind of aristocratic class that will pull their genealogies and lineages from people that are in the Iliad.
Right.
And so you're going to notice when you read through there, like, just get ready for it.
book.
Like
Second half of book 2.
yeah, Adam's favorite book in the whole Iliad, book 2. Like you're going to have some sections there that have all the charm and wit of a biblical genealogy.
Right.
But you have to realize that the reason is like his listeners, like his audience, if you will, are actually know like, oh, I'm related to that person. They're so they have these deep dives into the family trees. You got 2 guys that are going to get up and they're supposed to be at war, and we've got to have 10 minutes of introducing ourselves and who our grandfathers are.
And then you die.
And then one of them dies. So, why? Well, because his audience is incredibly interested in these facts. So one is, I think, to know his audience and how that actually shapes the text.
Okay.
The second point is, if you're reading it in a small group, so like if you're going to take our guide and you're like, okay, I've got my books, I'm going to follow along in the podcast. Like, we're part of that conversation. We're going to love to have you. And I'm going to get some guys together at my house and we're going to discuss this. So I think if you have the guide, 2 things. The preliminaries on Homer, that's fine just to kind of read, because obviously you're not going to pull that from the Iliad text itself, just to kind of read those through. However, when you get to actual text, I would recommend reading the book first, the book being like a chapter, right? So the first chapter. I'd read the chapter first, then I would read the guide. And the reason I recommend that is because like we want you to grow in your capacity to read these ancient texts yourself.
Right.
And so then it becomes a judge or a standard. And so you can read like book 1 and say, okay, this is where I think the plot points are. This is what I got out of it. Like, I think I've grasped this, or this was confusing. And then if you go back and read the guide, question answer, then you're able to judge what was your attention to detail according to the guide.
Yeah, and you'd be like, oh, I actually missed this. How could I miss this? This is what I like about the guide, as well as I read the chapter or read the book, and then I go back to the guide, and as I'm going through each question, I'll be like, are you kidding me? How did I miss this? And then I go back and read it and catch those insights. So the guide for me has been incredibly valuable. Even if you don't have a group of friends that you're going through, like, hang out with us. Let's do this. Let's go through this together. It's my first time, so I'm looking forward to doing it.
Yeah, and if you are in a group, I would literally just read the question out loud, let people discuss it for a bit, and then maybe read the question.
And then you get to sound really smart.
Right.
Like, don't tell them you have this guide. And then ask the question,
right.
And then when see what they all have to say.
My sources say.
Right.
So. Okay, very good. Anything else that we need to talk about with Homer?
No, I don't think so. I'm looking forward to it. Check out the website, thegreatbookspodcast.com. How do we get the URL? That was incredible. The Great Books Podcast.
Providence.
Yeah. Check it out, and make sure you share the episode with family and friends.
All right. Thank you, Adam.